Hey guys, my name is Tensor. Welcome to another Flutter tutorial video. In today's video, we will be talking about the basics of Redux in Flutter. And we'll be doing this by way of creating a simple list application that uses Redux. To get started, we want to import Redux and Flutter Redux. At the time of this video, Redux is version 3.0.0 and Flutter Redux is version 0.5.0. So the Redux library is Redux for Dart, and then the Flutter Redux library is an extension of that to bring it into the Flutter framework. We can now make our imports. So I'm going to bring in Flutter Redux, flutterredux.dart, and then Redux, redux.dart. So some of you may be wondering what exactly Redux is. Well, Redux is a unidirectional data flow architecture that makes it easy to maintain and test our state in our application. Redux is one of the more popular ways to make it so that you can have state in all parts of your application. In Redux, we have what's called a store. The store is what holds our state object, and that state object represents the state for the entire application. Every single time the user commits an event, that event then manipulates the state, and this event is called an action. This action gets dispatched to what's called a reducer function, and then the reducer actually updates the state, which then presents the new state to our view. Let's build out a model for the state of this application first. And the state for this application will just be a list of strings. We'll call it items, and then our liststate class will also have a constructor that takes in our items. We can also create a helper method that will allow us to set the initial state of our items into an empty list, and we can do it fairly simply by just writing liststate.initializeState and then putting items equal to an empty list. Now we can define the actions that the user can take in our application. We want to make it so that the user can essentially just add to our list. The singular action that we'll have in this application will be an add action. And our add action will contain a string, which we'll call our input, and we'll take that input from our input box, and then we can pass it into this add action. With this defined, we can now create our reducer. So as mentioned before, the reducer is what updates the store based on the action that gets sent into it. So we can send in a copy of our list state, which is our state, and then an action. And we can check to see what type our action is by saying if action is, and then we pass in the class add action, then we can have it do something. For our action add action, we want to return a list state object, and we'll define the items list by taking an empty list and then using the add all function to take whatever list we had before this, which is our current state of the application, pass it into this list, and then add the input that's being put into this add action class into the list as well. So if you consider what our state will look like over time, we'll start out with an empty list, and then as the user adds items to this list, this reducer is what manipulates our state to become a list of items. Every single time it does that, it takes the old items, pipes them into a new list, and then adds the new input to that new list. We can then add a second return statement that will execute if there's no action being pushed into here. And we can just say we want to return a list state where our items is equivalent to our current state.items. So if no action is being passed into this reducer, the reducer will essentially do nothing. Alright, so with all of that groundwork set up, now let's start to build out the actual application. So here I've created our main function, and then I've created the root widget for this application. And inside of our root widget, we can define what our store will look like. So we say final store equals store with list state inside of it. Then we pass in our reducer function and then the initial state that we want, which we can use our helper function liststate.initialState to create. So this will create an empty list for us, and then we can use that empty list with our reducer to manipulate our state. So now the way that we structure our root widget is a little different than what we have been doing before, and that's because we're going to wrap the entire application in this store provider widget. And the store provider widget is essentially just an inherited widget that gives everything in the widget tree access to our store. So we can say, okay, return a store provider with list state, and currently you need to define explicitly the type for the store provider, for the store, and then for another element which is called the store connector. And then there's a property for our store provider called store, and we can just put in our store, which we created up here, and then the child of this will be our material application. By wrapping our entire application this way, we can then use specialized widgets to gain access to our store anywhere in the application. So inside of our material app, we'll set it up like we do with anything else. I'll give this theme data.dark, and then I'll just give it a simple title, which will be called Redux List App, and then we'll have it point towards a widget called Home. Inside of our Home widget, which will be a stateless widget, we'll return a scaffold. We'll give it a simple app bar, and then the body will be a center with a column in it. The children inside of this column will be our list input, which will be the text box that the user can input strings into to push into our list. And then we'll have another widget called view list, which will be where the items come out of the list, which will be where we actually see the items. The list input widget will be a stateful widget. So as a result of that, we need to create a state class, so list input state, and we'll override the create state function, and then we'll put our build function in here. We also want to make sure to create a text editing controller because we will have a text box in here. So final text editing controller equals text editing controller. And then inside of this build function, we will be returning what's called a store connector. Our store connector is what allows us to connect to the store in different parts of the application. The store connector has two major properties associated with it. The first one is the converter. The converter takes our store and then converts it into what's called a view model. And the view model is essentially a version of the model that we can then pass into the second property, which is called the builder property. So here's a basic converter function. We take our store, and then on the store we dispatch the action add action, and this will call to our reducer, and it will pass in the state and the action, and then it will actually execute this piece of code. The problem with this converter, however, is that we have no way of passing our text input into our store. So we need to create an abstraction that allows us to do this. We want to create a type definition, and we'll use this to create a function type definition called addItem, which will be a function that takes in a string of text and then returns a dynamic variable. And then we'll use this type definition to create a class called viewModel. And our viewModel class can then have a property called addItem, which will be our function, and we can then put that function into the constructor. So now, rather than taking our converter and immediately dispatching to our add action like this, we can use this viewModel as a go-between to gain access to our input text. So our converter will then take our store and then output a new viewModel, and then we can define the addItemToList function inside of this converter in a way that we actually gain access to the input text, which is the text in our input box. And now we can pass that input text into our dispatch. So when we dispatch this to our reducer, the add action will also have this input text string attached to it. Down in our builder, we have our build context, and we also get this view model, and we can create a text field. And then inside of our text field, we put in our controller, And then for the onSubmitted, we can take the text that's being put into this text field, and we can then take our view model and call the addItemToList function on that piece of text, which will then of course call storeDispatch with our addAction and that text inside of our addAction, which will then be passed to our reducer, which will then send us back the appropriate state. And then of course we want to take our controller and clear the text. In effect, our view model, this view model class that we just created, is now a piece of middleware. And this middleware is essentially a new component which allows us to process an action before it reaches the reducer. Alright, so now we have our list input state widget built out. Let's build out our view list widget. Now, something to note on this next widget is that it can be a stateless widget because we're not actually dispatching any kind of action from this view list widget. Instead, all we're doing is we're reading from our store. So in effect, all of these state changes are happening inside of our list input state. And because the list input state is updating our store, it then re-renders all of the widgets that are connected to our store. Also, I almost forgot, we need to add a type annotation to our store connector. So because we know we're taking in the list state, and we now know that we're dealing with the view model inside of the builder here, we can then put in list state and view model. Now down here, we can create another store connector, and this one will wrap around our list state, and then a list of strings will be the view model that comes out of our converter. And the converter for this store connector is fairly simple compared to the other one. All we have to do is get our store and then call store, state, and items to get out our list of to-dos. And then we can pass those items into our builder function and then use it to build out our view. And our builder for this will be pretty simple. We'll just take a column, and then the children of the column will be a mapping of our items, where we take each of our items, put it into a text widget inside of a list tile, and then throw this back as a list of widgets. And now we should be able to build out this application. So for some reason, using a multi-line function here for the builder was causing an error. Now that we have a single line function, it is now working appropriately. Now that I'm using a single line function, it is now building appropriately. So here's our application. We can open up the text box and we can type in something like hello world. And when I hit this checkbox, it gets added to our list, which then gets pushed into our view down here. And we can just keep adding items and they'll keep being added to our list. The important thing to keep in mind about Redux is the data flow model for the actual Redux architecture. The data flow starts with an action. So every single time our application dispatches an action, and in this case we only have the single action, it gets either passed into middleware and then into the reducer, or it gets passed directly into the reducer. In our case, it goes from addAction to the view model to our reducer, and then our reducer outputs a new store, which then gets passed into our view, which is right down here. And then we can rinse and repeat. So we can dispatch another action, which will go into our middleware, and then into our reducer, and then into our store, and then out into our view. And when you add something like an API or some other side effect, typically you would add it to the middleware section of your application. So if we were reading in any kind of data, we would do it through our middleware. So we would add it into this view model class here. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you disliked this video, then by all means downvote it as much as you like. Have a good day.